The road twisted and turned sharply, the steep incline making the tires hum against the rugged asphalt. Daniel had been driving for what felt like hours, the engine's steady roar his only companion as the car climbed higher into the mountains. His eyes flicked between the winding road and the headlights piercing the encroaching night. It had been a long day, the drive longer than he'd expected, but the mountain retreat was just around the corner. He was almost there. The solitude had been what he needed. He could feel it in his bones. Work had become suffocating, his apartment a prison, his mind a tangled mess of unfinished projects and half-forgotten promises. A weekend in the mountains, away from everything, was supposed to be his salvation. Peace, quiet, space to breathe. He didn't know exactly why he chose this particular route. Just an old, barely marked mountain pass he'd stumbled upon on a map, the kind of road no one bothered to take unless they were familiar with the area or looking for a bit of adventure. That's exactly what he needed. A little adventure to get out of his head. As the light from his car cut through the trees, a shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't from the cold. Not yet anyway. The woods were dense on either side, the silhouettes of towering pines blocking out the sky and making it feel like he was driving through a tunnel of shadows. The road ahead stretched out in front of him, barely illuminated, giving everything a surreal, almost dreamlike quality. Then, without warning, he saw something up ahead. A large shape stood in the middle of the road, blocking his path. Daniel slammed his foot on the brake, his heart racing in his chest. The car slowed rapidly, headlights flashing across the figure ahead of him. At first, he thought it was a rock slide or a fallen tree, but as he got closer, he realized with a jolt that it was a bear, a massive grizzly bear, standing squarely in the middle of the narrow mountain road, its thick fur illuminated by the headlights. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at him with its dark eyes fixed on his car. The sight froze Daniel in place. He had seen bears before, usually from a distance, but never like this. Not this close, not in such an open, vulnerable space. His first instinct was to back up, but the road behind him was too narrow to maneuver. The bear didn't seem to care that he was there. It didn't growl, didn't make any threatening motions. It just stood there, blocking his way, unblinking. The silence between them felt like a heavy weight pressing against his chest. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel, unsure of what to do. He had been taught to avoid bears, to respect their space, to never engage. But this felt different. He wasn't sure if it was because of the bear's strange stillness or the eerie quiet that seemed to settle over everything. He honked the horn once, just to see if he could get the bear to move, but it didn't flinch. It didn't budge. It just continued to stand there, its eyes unwavering, as though it was waiting for something. He wasn't sure what to do next. Should he stay still and wait? Should he honk again? Or maybe rev the engine? His mind was racing, trying to process the situation, but nothing came to him. The bear took a small step forward. Daniel's pulse quickened. His mind flashed to all the worst-case scenarios. What if the bear attacked? What if it felt cornered and was about to charge? He wasn't prepared for this. There was no escape. The mountain road was too narrow, and there was nowhere to go. He could see the steep drop off the side, the cliff face looming dangerously close to his right. He was trapped. His hands were sweaty, and his breath felt shallow as he watched the bear inch closer, its massive form moving with a strange kind of deliberation. It was as though the bear was aware of him, aware of his hesitation, and was testing him, judging him. The car's engine hummed quietly beneath him as the seconds dragged on, the tension mounting in the air. Daniel didn't know how long he had been sitting there. Minutes? Hours? Time had lost its meaning in that moment. Then, to his surprise, the bear made another move, stepping to the side. It wasn't fleeing, not running away, but it was giving him a clear path. The bear stood just off the side of the road, still watching him, but this time it didn't block his way. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He was both relieved and unsettled at the same time. The bear hadn't attacked. It hadn't even seemed to want to. It was as though it had been waiting for him to do something, as though it had been waiting for him to understand something. For a long moment, Daniel just stared at the bear. He could feel his heart still pounding in his chest, his head spinning as his mind tried to make sense of what had just happened. Why had the bear acted this way? What had it been trying to communicate? He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something bigger than just a bear in his way. There was an odd sense of urgency in the air, a strange energy that he couldn't quite place. He glanced ahead, down the road, and saw nothing but the winding path leading deeper into the forest. The bear was still standing just off to the side, not moving, still watching. Its eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, and Daniel realized with a shock that the animal wasn't just staring at him. It was looking past him, toward the road ahead. Daniel's hand trembled as he slowly released the brake and nudged the car forward. The bear didn't move, but it remained watching him as he inched past. The air seemed to grow colder, the trees looming larger, as if they were closing in on him. He tried to shake off the unease, but the feeling persisted, heavy in his chest. When he reached the spot where the bear had been standing, he glanced at the rearview mirror and caught a final glimpse of the creature. It was still watching, its dark eyes never leaving him. He looked forward again, pressing the accelerator slightly, trying to ignore the tightening in his gut. Something was off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary bear encounter. This was a warning, but a warning of what? His thoughts were interrupted as the road ahead twisted sharply. The headlights flickered momentarily as the car's engine hummed, the low growl of the tires against the rough mountain road suddenly feeling more ominous. He couldn't see far ahead, only the curve of the road, the deep shadows of the forest, the looming cliffs beside him. The air grew even colder, the mountain winds sharper now, tugging at his coat and making the trees sway ominously. As the road curved again, Daniel caught sight of something strange up ahead, a flicker of movement in the distance, something almost too dark to see clearly against the blackened forest. His heart raced, and he slammed on the brakes, his eyes locked on the figure ahead. In the distance, where the road bent sharply to the left, a figure stood, silhouetted against the trees. It wasn't a person, but something much larger, much darker, a hulking shape, far too big to be human. The bear had not just been blocking his path, it had been guiding him, warning him, and now Daniel realized the real danger was ahead. Daniel's foot hovered above the brake pedal, his mind racing as his car slowly rolled toward the figure in the distance. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as the shape ahead grew clearer, an imposing silhouette outlined against the blackened woods. His heart hammered in his chest, but despite the intense fear clawing at him, he couldn't look away. The strange, almost magnetic pull of the figure kept his eyes fixed ahead. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there in the middle of the road, partially obscured by the trees. At first, Daniel thought it might be another bear, but there was something about it that felt different. It was too large, too dark. The more he stared, the more unsettling it became. It was as if the figure was waiting for him, like it knew exactly when he would arrive. As he drew closer, the figure began to resolve itself in the dim light, and his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a bear. Not this time. It was a man. Or at least it looked like one. Tall, hunched, and cloaked in shadow, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. The figure was dressed in a weathered cloak, tattered and frayed, the edges blending into the darkness. Daniel's fingers tightened on the wheel, the fear rising like a cold tide. He had to be imagining this. Who would be out here alone in the middle of nowhere? He considered turning back, retracing his steps down the winding road, but something stopped him. A deeper instinct told him that this man, this figure, was part of something larger, something he wasn't yet seeing. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but the bear was no longer in sight. It had vanished, just as silently as it had appeared, leaving Daniel alone with the stranger in the middle of the road. The figure shifted, and for the briefest moment, Daniel thought it might move toward him. But it didn't. Instead, it reached down, slowly, and grasped something from the ground. A large, gnarled stick, thick and worn from years of use. The man didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but he lifted the stick in a deliberate motion, pointing it toward Daniel's car. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his breath catching in his chest. What was happening? Why was this man here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night? And why was he blocking the road? The figure didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at Daniel, his eyes barely visible beneath the shadow of his hood. The air felt heavy with unspoken words, with a tension that was almost tangible. Daniel's mind spun in circles, searching for an explanation, but nothing made sense. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, the figure stepped aside, lowering the stick to the ground. He didn't leave the road entirely. Instead, he positioned himself just off to the side, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, watching Daniel as he approached. It was a gesture, Daniel realized, a way of saying, "Go ahead, but you're not going to like what comes next." Daniel's foot slowly eased off the brake. He didn't know what he was expecting, but the strange, cold sense of foreboding only seemed to grow stronger the closer he got. He wasn't sure why he hadn't turned around. Maybe it was because he was so far up the mountain, so deep in the wilderness, that he had no other choice but to keep going. Or maybe it was because something about the figure, about the stillness in his movements, compelled him to press on. But as he passed the man, his gaze shifted forward, to the road ahead. And that's when he saw it. At the edge of the road, just beyond the bend, was something that shouldn't have been there. A massive, twisted tree, its gnarled branches stretching across the road like skeletal hands, blocking any further passage. Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he slammed his foot down on the brake, his car coming to a halt mere feet from the obstruction. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the fallen tree, his pulse pounding in his ears. It had happened so suddenly, so without warning, that it took a moment for his mind to catch up with reality. The tree hadn't fallen by accident. Someone had placed it there, or something had placed it there. The cold, unsettling realization hit him like a slap in the face. The figure in the road hadn't just been waiting for him. It had been trying to stop him from moving forward. But why? Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to process what was happening. There was no way this could be a coincidence. The bear, the figure, the fallen tree, it was all part of something. Something he wasn't supposed to understand yet. The forest felt alive around him, the trees whispering in the wind, the shadows flickering just beyond his vision. The road stretched out ahead of him, but it felt like it was leading into a void, a place where logic didn't exist, where time and space twisted in ways he couldn't comprehend. He had always thought of the wilderness as a peaceful place, a place of escape, but now it felt like a trap, a web that had ensnared him the moment he set foot on it. His mind raced, trying to formulate a plan, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. But there was no turning back now. The figure was still there, standing just off to the side, watching him. The bear was somewhere in the shadows, waiting, and the road ahead was blocked by the fallen tree, an insurmountable obstacle. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the realization struck him like a blow. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't just a random series of events. This was something bigger, something that had been set in motion long before he had ever set foot on this mountain road. Someone or something didn't want him to go any further. His eyes flicked back to the figure in the road. The man was still standing there, still watching him, but there was no judgment in his expression, no malice, only something like resignation, as though he knew this was the only way it could be, that this was the way things were meant to unfold. The figure took a slow step toward the car, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Daniel's breath caught in his chest as the man reached out and placed a hand on the car's hood. It was a strange, silent gesture, but it spoke volumes. The man was telling him something important, something that Daniel needed to understand. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said, his voice low, rough like gravel, but with a strange kind of sorrow in it. "You're not supposed to see this." Daniel's heart froze. The words echoed in his mind, but they didn't make sense. What was he talking about? What wasn't he supposed to see? I don't understand," Daniel said, his voice trembling, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, his eyes still fixed on Daniel. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. his form swallowed by the darkness of the mountain. For a moment, Daniel sat there, motionless, unsure of what to do. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost deafening now that the man was gone. But Daniel knew one thing for certain. Something had just shifted, something had changed, and whatever it was far from over. He glanced once more at the fallen tree blocking his way. There was no way around it, no way through it. But he couldn't stay here. He couldn't turn back. Whatever was waiting for him up the road, whatever warning had been issued, he needed to understand it. Taking a deep breath, Daniel put the car into reverse, slowly backing away from the tree. The road was narrow, but he managed to turn around, his heart pounding in his chest as he faced the darkness behind him. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he couldn't ignore the feeling in the pit of his stomach. The feeling that he was being led towards something far bigger than himself. Something that could change everything. And no matter how much he wanted to turn around, no matter how much his instincts screamed at him to leave, he knew that this road, this path, was the only one that would lead him to the answers he desperately needed. With one last glance toward the shadows where the figure had vanished, Daniel pressed the accelerator and drove into the darkness, the mountain road stretching out before him like a never-ending mystery. The car's headlights cut through the fog that had begun to settle over the mountain road like a thick blanket, shrouding everything in an eerie, ghostly haze. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he continued down the winding path, the sharp turns and sudden dips of the road keeping him on edge. Every so often, the trees would part just enough for him to catch a glimpse of the sheer drop off the side of the road, an unfathomable fall into the darkness below. The events of the past few minutes had rattled him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that the mountain itself was calling him forward, pulling him deeper into something he wasn't ready to understand. The encounter with the bear, the strange figure in the road, and the fallen tree, they weren't accidents. No, they were deliberate, purposeful, as though the mountain had been waiting for him, guiding him in some unseen way. But why? And why now? Daniel felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity, the two emotions swirling together inside him, making it hard to focus. His mind refused to let go of the figure, the man in the cloak. The way he had stood there, unmoving, as if he had known exactly when Daniel would arrive. And the words he had spoken, their weight settling heavily in Daniel's chest. You're not supposed to be here. You're not supposed to see this. What had he meant by that? Was this some kind of warning? Was Daniel intruding on something hidden, something ancient? The road twisted again, and Daniel's attention snapped back to the wheel as he rounded another sharp bend. The fog thickened, obscuring his view even further, and he had to slow down, squinting into the swirling mist. His heart thudded with each passing second, the unease gnawing at him. The headlights reflected off something ahead, something metallic. A flash of red. Daniel's eyes widened as he jerked the wheel to the left, barely avoiding a car that had suddenly appeared in the middle of the road. His tires screeched, and the car veered dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. But somehow, he managed to regain control, the car bouncing slightly as he straightened it back onto the narrow road. His heart was racing, and for a moment, he sat there, staring at the place where the car had been, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He hadn't seen it coming. There had been no warning, no time to react. But as he glanced to the side, he saw the figure again, standing by the side of the road, watching him. The figure that had warned him. The man in the cloak, his dark eyes fixed on Daniel like a sentinel, unmoving. The car he had nearly collided with was gone, as though it had never been there. Just a fleeting image, a trick of the mist. Is this real? Daniel whispered to himself, his voice trembling. The fog had begun to dissipate slightly, but the eerie, unreal feeling lingered in the air. He wasn't sure if he was losing his mind or if something deeper was at play. The mountain felt alive in a way he couldn't understand, like it had its own secrets. Secrets that were beginning to unfold one by one, pulling him into their web. He accelerated again, driving cautiously but faster now, as if the figure would disappear if he didn't keep moving. Every instinct told him to press on. He had to get to the lodge, had to find answers. But the road ahead seemed endless, and the tension in his chest only grew with each mile. It wasn't long before he saw it again. A shape, barely visible in the mist, standing on the side of the road. This time, it wasn't the figure. This was something different. The outline of a car, parked haphazardly in the middle of the road, its headlights off. The same model as his own, a car he'd seen parked at the foot of the mountain, right before he started the drive. But this wasn't the same car. The license plate was different, and the driver's side door was open. Daniel's stomach twisted. His hands felt clammy against the steering wheel, but he couldn't stop himself from approaching. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing in around him, and the trees on either side of the road appeared like dark sentinels, watching his every move. As he came closer to the car, he could see that the driver's seat was empty, but something inside the car gleamed faintly in the dim light. A small object on the dashboard, reflecting off the car's glass. He slowed to a stop, his pulse quickening. His eyes locked onto the object, and it took him a moment to realize what it was. A small silver necklace, hanging from the rearview mirror, pendant shaped like a bear, the same symbol he had seen on the man in the cloak. Daniel's mind reeled as he looked at the car, then at the necklace, the connection hitting him like a wave. He remembered what the figure had said. "You're not supposed to be here." It wasn't just the figure. This place, this mountain, was trying to tell him something, to warn him about something, and it was all connected. The bear, the necklace, the car, it was all a part of the same puzzle. His heart pounded in his chest as he carefully got out of the car, his legs shaky beneath him. The silence was suffocating, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced around, but there was nothing. Just the fog, the trees, and the faint outline of the car in front of him. He stepped cautiously toward the vehicle, his footsteps barely audible against the ground. As he reached the open door, his eyes caught something on the floor. A trail of muddy footprints leading away from the car, disappearing into the trees. Without thinking, Daniel followed the footprints, drawn by something he couldn't quite explain. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back, to get back in the car and drive away from this madness. But he couldn't. Not now. Something had been set in motion, and he had to see it through. The footprints led him deeper into the forest, and as he pushed through the thick underbrush, he felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on him. The trees seemed to close in around him, the air thick with the smell of earth and damp wood. The fog seemed to swirl more tightly now, wrapping him in its embrace, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, as he rounded a bend in the trail, he saw it. A small clearing opened up before him, and in the center of it stood an altar. A stone platform roughly hewn, covered in symbols that seemed familiar yet alien. The air felt charged, electric, and Daniel could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was a weight in the air, an energy that thrummed through the ground, and it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. On the altar, a figure lay still, the body draped in a weathered cloak. The same cloak, the same figure, and the necklace was there too, hanging from the neck of the figure on the altar, gleaming faintly in the mist. Daniel's heart slammed in his chest as he approached, but as he did, a low growl rose from the shadows, echoing through the clearing. He froze. The growl wasn't from a bear. It was something else, something deeper, more primal. And then, from the trees, the bear emerged again. But this time, it wasn't just a bear. It was standing upright, towering over him on two legs, its massive form bathed in the ethereal glow of the mist. Its eyes, those eyes, locked onto Daniel, as if it had been waiting for him. He understood, finally. This wasn't just a warning. It was a call. Ethan stood still, his breath shallow and quick. The bear had moved away, but its presence lingered in the air, like the memory of something significant. The wilderness, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now seemed different, more alive, more unpredictable, and perhaps more dangerous than he had ever realized. The bear's behavior, its quiet, assessing stare, had broken through his understanding of the wild. It wasn't the aggression or the challenge he had feared. Instead, it was something deeper, a reminder of the raw, untamable power that existed in nature. Ethan had always thought he understood it, but now, in the stillness of the forest, he realized how little he truly knew. The wild had its own rhythm, one that didn't always align with human logic. He glanced back at the spot where the bear had stood, the dark form disappearing into the shadows of the trees. There was no growl, no roar, just a quiet departure, as if the bear had fulfilled its purpose. It had shown him something, but what? Ethan felt an inexplicable urge to follow it, to understand, but the bear had gone. And with it, the tension, the fear, the confusion all seemed to vanish. The forest around him no longer felt threatening, felt still, calm, as if the animal's departure had restored a balance that he didn't fully comprehend. He turned his back on the woods for a moment, refocusing his attention on the campfire. The flames were still alive, crackling and dancing in the cold night air. The warmth they offered seemed to ground him, but the questions inside his mind kept swirling, unanswered. What had the bear wanted? Why had it studied him, then left without attacking? In every encounter with the wild, there was a lesson, but what was this one? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the bear's actions defied everything he thought he knew about survival, about nature. In the distance, the wind picked up again, a soft whisper running through the trees. It was the only sound in the night. Ethan listened, waiting, but nothing else happened. The forest, once full of potential danger, now seemed silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for him to understand. He couldn't explain it. He didn't know if he ever would. But deep down, he knew that this encounter was important. It had shifted something inside him, something profound. He wasn't the same person who had arrived here days ago, looking for solitude. He wasn't even the same person who had stared down the bear and felt fear. He had changed. The wilderness wasn't something he could control, and he didn't need to. It was alive, unpredictable, and beautiful in its raw power. The bear had reminded him of that, reminded him that he was not in charge here. He was merely a part of it. Ethan rose from the fire, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't expected. The journey was still ahead of him. There was so much more to discover, more to understand. And though he had no answers, he felt the urge to keep moving forward, to see where the wild would lead him next. With one final look at the fading light of the fire, he packed his things. The night was deepening, and the forest felt vast, full of secrets yet to be uncovered. He wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. He was ready, and as he walked into the night, the forest seemed to breathe with him, alive, waiting. Somewhere deep within its heart, the bear watched as it always had, its presence a silent reminder that nature, in all its untamed glory, was never truly conquered. Simply was. Ethan's journey was far from over, and though he couldn't yet understand everything, he knew this much. He would never see the wilderness the same way again.